Okay, here's wages and salaries. Somewhat different story, but basically, mostly the movement is upward as well. Next, please. Okay, now I'm not saying working people are doing that well. As I mentioned before, there has been a decline in the growth of the compensation of workers in this country, really starting about 1974. Okay. So there is a real issue here in terms of slow growth of incomes of working people. What I'm saying is it's not a distributional issue. Okay? What does it due to if it's not due to distribution? The problems in capitalist production. Here's the net value added, the thick gray, or the output of the corporations. The light gray is the compensation of the employees. 1947 to 73. They grow at basically the same rate. 1973 to 2007, they grow at basically the same rate. That's why the shares are stable. Okay? So the left side is deflated in one way, adjusted for inflation in one way. Here it's adjusted for inflation in a different way. Okay? In both cases, it's very clear. The growth of compensation of U.S. workers declines. But why does it decline? Because the growth of corporate output is declining. Okay? It's not a distributional issue. There's a problem, but it's rooted in production rather than in distribution. Okay, so that tells us something, I think, about notions that have become very prevalent, that we can sort of solve all of our economic problems by redistribution. Okay. This crisis is not rooted in the end in distribution. It's not a distributional crisis. And share the wealth struggles face strict limits because the wealth has not been there to share. We've had a decline in the growth of output and stuff. And the latest crisis of this, of course, exacerbated this problem. There's a lot less there. Now, struggles to protect and enhance people's standard of living, I do believe they can succeed. I'm not saying they can't succeed. I'm saying they can succeed. What I'm saying is that they will cause profitability to fall further. Workers get more, corporations get less. Okay. They happen to be correct about that. It's just an accounting issue. You have a pool of output of a company or income. Okay? More of it goes here, less of it goes there. So if the workers get more, the companies get less. If the companies get more, the workers get less. It's just like a pie. You can't cut a pie and give one person a bigger slice and give the other person a bigger slice if you're only cutting it in two. It's just purely accounting. So people can do better, but it's going to cause profitability to go down. And that will make the system even less stable and prone to crises and recessions. So working people's fights to protect their standard of living do help them. And it's definitely something to fight for. People are doing that. They don't need me to tell them to do that. Okay? The point is, a lot of people say, oh, you're helping the economy. We're going to have wage-led growth. We're going to make the economy better by redistributing the income toward the bottom, and you guys all spend it on goods and services and don't buy financial assets. There's a lot of problems with that story. The basic problem is the people at the bottom get more, the workers get more, the companies get less. So it's hurting the capitalist economy in the sense of a capitalist economy. It's helping most of the people in the economy. Unfortunately, we live in a system called capitalism, and unfortunately, this kind of system, the interest of the economy and the interest of the people in it, by and large, are quite different. Okay, so just very briefly, what are the prospects for the future? We could have, the policymakers do not want this, but we might have something like happened in the Great Depression. Full-scale destruction of capital values. Could lead to a new boom, such as we had after World War II. It could lead to collapse. Could lead to revolution. Okay? But if it didn't lead to collapse or revolution, that would be a solution of sorts. What I think they're trying to do very clearly is more kicking of the can down the road. They've been doing that for decades, And in the last several years, we've had a lot of that. Papering over bad debt with more debt. Okay? What will it lead to? I think it's going to lead to what it's led to thus far. And if you have any knowledge of what happened in Japan during its lost decade, now 2 lost decades, you can see what happens when you kick the can down the road, you pay over debt with more debt, or you don't recognize bad debt. Continued sluggishness, recurrent crises, and as the debt mounts, the US government's and other governments' ability to restore confidence declines. Okay? We had a crisis of confidence, that was the financial crisis. How did the financial crisis end? Well, investors' confidence, which just means their confidence that they're going to be repaid, was restored because the US government came to the rescue and said, here, we'll cover all your losses, basically, all of the creditors. Okay? But the confidence of the investors that they're going to be repaid can only be restored by the US or any other government as long as the investors have confidence that these governments have the ability and will to repay them. Okay? That's starting to wane with what's happening in the European Union now, I think. Okay, finally, there is a prospect, I think, of socialism. I think that it's the only real cure for the kind of long-term malaise that we have, except for the full-scale destruction of capital value. Unless we get that full-scale destruction of capital value, I think we're in for continued sluggishness, and really you just need a different social system to solve these problems on a non-capitalist basis, without immense destruction. Okay, next slide. Okay, so yeah, here's the book. I do have some copies. I'd like to give them away free. You can't do that. They're $23. And this is also my prior book, Retaining Marxist Capital, $23. Let me get a pen so that if I need to respond to something that I can't remember, I can write it down. Okay. Actually, can I have a piece of paper as well? I have a blue paper. Thanks very much.
All right, so I'll take a list for questions. So raise your hand or get my attention.
Not at all.
Should I just?
Yes, please. Yes.
So, thank you. If I understand correctly, the outlines of your argument make the case that there is a systemic reproduction of a form of inequality, one that's called capital, and that is not a distribution problem, it's a production problem, and thus this crisis is going to continue to reproduce itself, or, as you put it, there's a potential collapse of the system. I was wondering about that option, because in your book you actually mention some of the arguments that happened in the early 20th century in the SPD between, and this may be obscure history, but it's an important conversation that happens between Luxemburg and Bernstein about the nature of prices and capitalism. Mm-hmm. That from one perspective, Bernstein is saying that capitalism is constantly according to Bernstein, that it's finding ways in which to ameliorate the contradiction, and that Luxemburg is actually saying, in fact, all the things that you're pointing to in terms of the democratization of production, et cetera, are actually deepening the crisis of capitalism. And then later on in that pamphlet, in Reform and Revolution, he says it's actually both. It's a deepening of the crisis, but you can also see it from another perspective, that it's an amelioration of the crisis. And I think that what she meant by that is that insofar as there was a political context which would point these problems out as potential opportunities for the reconstitution of society, that these could be thought of as actually a crisis. Like, to what extent is this problem that we're facing today, in the absence of the left, can it be called a crisis in the kind of terms that Luxemburg thought that it could be called a crisis?
How do you want me to do this? Respond one by one?
I think so.
Yeah. These terms are really unfortunate when you have one thing, it's an economic crisis, and you've got other notions of crisis being talked about together. They're very different things. I mean, economic crisis is not like a Marxian term. For a long time, it was just like Marxists who used this, but it was a good old, 19th century economic term for, a financial rupture. Recently, we've been using that term, for financial crisis, so it no longer has this specifically Marxian flavor. In an economic sense, you don't have a crisis that lasts, 30, 40 years. So some people say, well, the economy's been in crisis since the 70s. Well, that's not really the case. We've had malaise, we've had what I call relative stagnation. Then you get various notions of social crisis, ecological crisis, political crisis. These are all different things. I don't think it's particularly helpful to deal with them in an I don't think it's helpful at all to deal with them in an undifferentiated way. So, to try to differentiate this, does economic crisis or economic malaise lead to a political crisis for capitalism in the absence of revolt? I think that's what this is boiling down to. Obviously, if it does, it's a different kind. It's a question of which country is going to benefit at the expense of another country. It's the question of, will the creditors get their money back? And if so, how are they going to get it from the government? Or are they going to have to take a 74% haircut? or so forth. So I think if we just differentiate these concepts, they become much more manageable. And I don't think that I have then anything really privileged to offer. I just gave you my own opinion.